Deconstructing conclusions. Return to the hook or prelude. This video is part 4 of the Deconstructing Conclusions series, a series intended to train you in the art of crafting the 4 elements of a conclusion for research writing. This video assumes that you are already familiar with the concept of the hook or prelude in an introduction. For more information on how to initially pose a hook in your introduction, please check out the Deconstructing Introduction series on our YouTube channel at WC_SE. Much like restating your thesis, returning to the hook may seem like an expendable and potentially jading element of a conclusion. It is true that if the writer copies and pastes the hook or something nearly identical to it into their conclusion, the reader will naturally feel jaded by the apparent waste of the reader's time. However, every good conclusion serves a recursive function. That is, a conclusion not only extends new implications and applications, but also loops the reader back to where the essay began, having equipped the reader with a fresh perspective, a compelling argument, and significant next steps. This loop allows the process of reflection, evaluation, and application to keep repeating beyond the conclusion of the essay. Returning to the hook or prelude is an effective and important way to summon readers back to the starting point, back to the context or the illustration of the problem, or the sense of disruption that pressed them to consider your question and argument in the first place. So if the return to the hook does not mean duplicating the hook in your conclusion, then how should you style this element of the conclusion? It is generally best to think of returning to the hook as the act of echoing the hook, rather than cloning the hook. The reader should be able to recognize the thematic movement back to the initial context, problem, or disruption. Writers typically develop this recursive movement in one of 3 ways. First, writers could illustrate or identify the argument in a form that mirrors the hook. Suppose my essay was on suffering as something to be desired. If my hook illustrated the problem with anecdotes of suffering, or simply built up to a disruption by noting how no one is pre-wired to desire suffering, then my return to the hook could be a concluding anecdote of someone going through similar suffering with joy, grateful for the opportunity to suffer. Or it could conclude by pointing out the potential to be rewired away from the constant fear and avoidance of suffering. It is often good practice to mirror the form of your hook in your return to the hook in the conclusion. If you told an anecdote in the introduction, maybe an anecdote would be fitting in the conclusion. If you gave statistics, then give the statistics of your new findings in the conclusion. Second, writers could connect and extend the idea of the hook into a related context. This approach pairs well with conclusions that offer suggestions for further research. Consider this example. Say my paper studied how reading old books altered the thought patterns and social awareness of modern Americans. And say my hook was a C.S. Lewis quotation about the need to read old books. My return to the hook may be something like this. The pattern of reflecting on and learning from the past applies to all media, not just books, so researchers may benefit from mapping the effects of pre-modern music on the social awareness and cultural engagement of modern Americans. Note how this return to the hook not only sounds similar to the Lewis quotation, but also loops the reader back to the initial idea, thinking about how the old shapes the new. Yet it does so in a way that keeps the process repeating, prompting readers to think about how old music may have a formative influence on the social imaginary of modern Americans. Third, writers could expound on the hook in light of the preceding argument. This final approach typically calls readers back to the quotation or idea in the introduction and explains or unpacks the idea with the new resources and language provided by the preceding argument. Consider this example. Say my hook was the quotation, "Little by little one travels far." My essay argued for a slow, incremental approach to language learning that consisted of completing small weekly units over a 10-year period. My return to the hook could be something like this. Little by little, language learners gain proficiency in an incremental 10-year program, yet verb by verb and noun by noun they can go far in the language of their choosing. This example reminds readers of the hook and recasts the idea conveyed by the hook in light of the preceding argument. In the introduction, the hook was simply a general principle. However, in the conclusion, the return to the hook echoed the hook in light of the specific argument about language learning. All 3 approaches illustrate the recursive function of this element, demonstrating how to effectively echo the hook and wrap up a conclusion. It is worth noting that this element of the conclusion is usually the same length or shorter than its counterpart in the introduction. After offering implications and applications for your readers, try to wrap up your conclusion quickly rather than being verbose. Choose your words and style carefully, since your concluding words often resonate with your readers long after they finish reading the essay. Thank you for watching this video on returning to the hook. This video marks the end of the 4-part deconstructing conclusion series. If you missed the earlier videos in this series, please feel free to go back and watch the series overview, as well as the corresponding video for each element of a conclusion. If you're looking for other resources on writing, editing, citing, or researching, check out the other videos on our YouTube channel at WC_SE. Thank you, and keep writing.